So I'm going to assume that you can hear me. If I end up talking to myself for 3/4 of an hour, well, that won't be the first time. So let me introduce myself. My name is Robert Moores. I'm Client Relationships Director with Fulcrum Digital. So Fulcrum Digital, very briefly, is a 20-year-old company employing about 1,000 people globally, specializing in digital acceleration and creativity. Today we're covering digital maturity. We have an agenda. We're a few minutes late already, so we're going to get going straight through it. I'm not going to read all those out. Give you a quick minute to read them, and then we'll get straight into it. By way of qualification, I've been in this industry a long time, so I'm certainly digitally mature. I've worked as a trainee COBOL programmer back in the day when we were on coding sheets. I worked as a business analyst, project manager, solutions architect, worked in the UK, USA, Australia, worked for finance, banking, education, retail, health, government, local authorities. So been around quite a bit, certainly in terms of the breadth of experience. That's a lot. Prince 2 practitioner, certified Scrum Master, practitioner in solution architecture. So I've got a few badges as well. But today we're talking about digital maturity, and I'm hoping that my experience and my qualifications will make that a relevant topic for you. So almost every organization we speak to is partway through a digital transformation. For some, that's pretty much old wine in new bottles, where digital transformation is just a new, sexier term for IT upgrades that gets them the funding they need. That's fine. Others do have varying levels of understanding of what digital transformation involves, but don't really have a clear vision or goals around digital maturity. And so after a few platform or foundation type of implementations, which are always the first to go through a transformation program, in my experience, the program starts running out steam and they revert back to the usual IT change portfolio management process, assuming you have one, of course. Like Alice, if we don't know where we currently are and where we want to get to in terms of digital maturity, then we might as well wander down any path without a plan and hope that we eventually get there. And that's a problem. It's a missed opportunity to improve our capabilities, create new value, and of course, it doesn't do the reputation of the IT department any good at all. So hopefully this webinar will encourage you to take a structured approach to digital transformation and understand how a digital maturity can assist you. Digital maturity assessment can assist you in your journey. There's a couple of things I want to make very clear from the start. What we're presenting today is a very lightweight and stripped down version of our framework. We have a 2-day course that gets into the full detail of that framework if you're interested, and that does always start bang on time. Secondly, digital maturity is highly contextual. It will look very different for a steel mill than for a university, than for a digital product software company. So please bear that in mind. So what we're presenting here is a high-level framework and some insights based on our experience. So you need to take this and shape it for your own organization. Now, we were going to have a poll, but I'm not going to because I'm having problems with the technology and I don't trust that poll to work. So we'll give that a miss and move straight into some definitions. So digital maturity assessment sounds like an easy term to understand, but our experience is that when we get a group of people in a room, they all start to have different ideas about what it means, what it can be used for, and how to go about it. So we're going to cover that off first. What do we mean by the term digital maturity assessment? Why might we be interested in undertaking one? And how might we go about running an assessment? So let's start with the term assessment. We're going to measure something, lots of things. Are we clear about what we're going to measure, what measures we'll use, and how we'll measure it? Who's going to be involved? Do we want to use that measurement to compare ourselves with other organizations or simply to set an internal baseline? All these questions need to be answered and addressed and answered by you before you start an assessment. Implicit in any assessment is a notion of current and target state. So we'll usually want to assess our current level of digital maturity and set a target level. And we'll come back and talk about that later. Obviously, that's the main part of the seminar. Maturity, a bit more easy, hopefully, to get our heads around. Obviously, it's a state that's more advanced than one that's immature. But we might consider maturity to be relative or contextual rather than absolute, in the same way that we might say someone is mature for their age. Unlike people becoming and remaining more mature, tomorrow's understanding of digital maturity is going to be different from yesterday's. What counts as maturity is a moving target, so our assessment model needs to take account of that. And finally, here, the digital maturity of an organization isn't based just on having a certain set of technologies or even the latest technologies. You might have heard the acronyms SMAC or DARK at any point in time, but it's really about the relentless pursuit of creating new value through the use of digital technologies, whatever they are. So ultimately, digital maturity isn't about reaching a destination. It's about having the right equipment and tools and desire to make the journey. So let's stay on the theme of what and look at what digital maturity encompasses. We split this into 3 areas, and we'll come back and look at this in more detail. So the areas we look at are change focus, which covers strategy, management, design, people, and the actual execution of the capability. And so we'll come back and look at those in more detail because they're what we'll assess, the criteria that we'll assess against. Next, so having defined what digital maturity and assessment mean, let's have a little consideration of why a digital maturity assessment might be useful. I'm not going to spend long on this slide. The takeaway here is to be clear about why you want to undertake a digital maturity assessment. As with all initiatives, starting with the end in mind and working backwards is more likely to result in something that's useful and usable and used than just starting out with a hunch or a good idea. The 3 reasons provided here aren't mutually exclusive. Ideally, they'll feed each other. In our experience, a digital maturity assessment can be a valuable precursor to developing a digital strategy because it gets a conversation going, identifies levels of resistance to change, and gets people talking about direction and objectives. So don't feel that you need to have a digital strategy first. A digital maturity assessment is a great precursor to a strategy. In terms of change priorities, you'll note we've put inform change priorities, not determine them. It's important to understand that a digital maturity assessment won't tell you what changes you need to make. I hope that's not brought too many gasps of horror. It will tell you at best where you are now and what good looks like. And every organisation has a finite capacity for change, and boards aren't usually short of proposals to spend the money on. What changes you actually make will be what delivers the most value, not just what is determined by the gap in your maturity level. Making a capability more digitally mature might not be the most pressing issue for the organisation, so it's best to see the results of the assessment as another lens that informs change and not as a mandate for change in itself. As you undertake the assessment, design, planning and execution, your knowledge of the threats and opportunities that digital tech brings will increase. That's because you'll be looking closely at the services you offer and the capabilities that underpin them, and at least starting to explore what's happening in your sector, competitors, new entrants, new ways of engaging with customers and delivering the services you offer. All of these 3 reasons have one thing in common. They should drive action. Otherwise, there's no business case for undertaking the assessment. So again, be very clear as to why you're undertaking the assessment, and that'll help you secure a budget for doing so. Okay, having spoken about the what and the why, we're now going to check on the how, at least part of it. And this is the process we go through to execute a successful assessment. That boils down to a few things: good planning, having the right resources, getting the commitment to undertaking and acting on the assessment, and having the time to execute all of the steps. We've broken our process down into 7 steps. The number isn't important. You may have 3, you may have 23. The takeaway here is to have a plan, get proper commitment to it, and execute on it. If you don't get commitment, it's like any change initiative. You'll find nobody turns up for your workshops, nobody completes your questionnaire, and the results of the assessment are filed away to be looked at when the leadership team has the time to do so, which will most likely be never. So I'd like to share some tips based on, just give me 1 second. Okay, I understand that the slides aren't changing. I am changing them. I'm not quite sure what we need to do that. Okay, hopefully. That's fix that. Let me just go back one slide and forward one slide and just check that that's working now. Okay. So I talked about the 3 dimensions of digital maturity, which we'll come back to later: change, focus, people, and capability execution. Spoke about why an assessment might be useful, and I talked about 7 steps that we have for the process. So just some tips on that again. Firstly, you don't have to assess the digital maturity of your whole organization in one go. You're unlikely to get it all right the first time anyway, so piloting it in a part of your organization first would be prudent. Then you can check how well each of these steps went, and if necessary, adjust and go again. And although it's tempting, I really don't recommend using the IT department for the pilot. Kind of marking your own homework, and the participants are very likely to get too focused on particular technologies. My recommendation would be to find a product or service owner in the business for the pilot, someone who's really keen, has got at least an inkling of the potential of digital transformation, and use that for your pilot. The second tip is to get the right level of granularity. If you do a very high level of assessment without drilling down into the detail and into different areas of the organization, you run the risk of getting a very generic assessment that's not particularly actionable, just be too high level and waffly. On the other hand, if you get into too much detail, you run the danger at the other end of getting bogged down in complex scoring systems and weighted averages and roll-ups that don't really sit nicely across all the organization. You'll lose momentum because of the time that it takes and the enthusiasm that it drains from people, and you'll lose sight of the big picture. So again, piloting the assessment will help with determining the right level of granularity. So having got an understanding of the what, why, and at least part of the how of the digital maturity assessment, let's have a look at what in the organisation we'll be assessing and some of the tools we might want to use. I'm just going to take a little drink of water. As we mentioned before, the purpose of the assessment is to inform change in your organisation. So at the outset, we need to make sure that our goals, in terms of our target maturity levels, are aligned with the business model and strategy. So think a B2B low-cost distributor may have a very different concept of digital maturity than a B2C firm that provides services to high net worth individuals. So let's make sure that we understand and are constrained by the business model and the business strategy. So our model links that model and strategy, capabilities, the digital maturity dimensions, the current and target maturity levels, and the changes that this will inform. If you think of this diagram as a process model, then the Now I'm skipping a slide now. That's okay. You saw this slide, you would see there's a process model with business model and strategy on the input side, and the change portfolio inputs on the output side, with the model detail, with the capabilities, the dimensions, and the maturity scoring in the middle. Ultimately, what we're assessing is the digital maturity of business capabilities, and we'll use the digital maturity dimensions to break down the capability into elements that we can attach a score to. Which is fine if you're familiar with business capabilities, and a great learning opportunity if you're not. In essence, a business capability refers to the abilities that an organization needs to have, i.e. the things it needs to be able to do in order to deliver value to its customers or service users. You can see some examples of capabilities in the capability model on this slide. A capability is a logical construct that helps us model and understand our organization at different levels. And as such, capabilities are usually hierarchical and composed of lower level capabilities. And so your assessment can measure digital maturity at a high level or at a low level and roll it up. We'll see that at a later date. A later slide, same date. Another useful feature of capabilities is that you can use them to provide focus for your assessment. To assess every facet of an organization can be a huge undertaking, and capabilities provide a way to split it into more manageable chunks. To assist further with this, capabilities are usually split into groups. In this example, you can see that there's core capabilities and differentiating capabilities. The differentiating ones and the core ones are marked out in dashed and bold, respectively. We usually say that the focus for core capabilities should be cost reduction and standardization, while for differentiating capabilities, the focus is on creating a unique value proposition. So this can help with prioritizing our assessment, to focus our assessment. Also, we can do a capability heat mapping exercise to prioritize the capabilities to be assessed. So a heat map, for example, will identify things like high cost, at risk, or poorly performing capabilities, depending on what it's being used for. There's many ways of conceptualizing and modeling capabilities, and we'd usually work with whatever your organization uses, as that will be readily understood, at least by the leadership and hopefully by the leadership team. If you don't have a capability model, then there's many available, some free, some paid for, some generic, some industry or sector specific, some open and some proprietary. Most of the big consultancies and organizations representing sectors have them. For example, USISA in the HE sector, and you can Google web search. Other search engines are available for various capability models. As I stated, our assessment model involves assessing the digital maturity of business capabilities. An alternative would be to assess the digital maturity of business services, and that's something you may have come across before. Our view is that while focusing on business services can take you a long way in assessing your current digital maturity level, and indeed we do have service mapping as a technique we use, there's a risk that will only take you so far in increasing the level of digital maturity for that capability, as the focus tend to be on improving what's already there in terms of the existing services, rather than taking a leap to completely transform how the capability is delivered and creating new services. Capabilities, on the other hand, are much more slow-moving, abstract, and they're not specific in their implementation. So generally, we find they make a better anchor for assessment. So let's go back to this slide, which could be the first time you've seen it. These are what we're going to assess. These are the dimensions that we're going to assess capabilities against. So we'll just have a look at these in a little bit more detail. And so we haven't got time to drill into these. I could easily spend an hour, a few, talking about each of these. Digital first, digital by design, digital by default. These are standard strap lines for a digital strategy, where we design for digital first, then add in real world constraints. It's still too often the case that we design for the physical world first, and digital is almost an afterthought. Think of services that are simply an online version of a paper process, with online forms replacing paper-based forms. That would be typical of many organizations. So the fact that your organization has an articulated digital strategy that puts digital at the heart of everything it does is a strong indicator of digital maturity in this dimension. Customer centricity refers to having a relentless focus on the customer. If our design starts with a process, we run the danger of losing focus on what's most important to the customer. So we like to have design starting with the customer journey, how to improve it, how to simplify it, how to personalize it, how to anticipate it, etc. And process follows from that. Governance, what do we mean by that? Governance gets a high score for digital maturity if change is governed by agile and lean principles, if there's a product rather than a project orientation, and if employees are empowered to make changes with minimal oversight, minimal quality gates, and other forms of bureaucracy. And the people, obviously, we want to assess the digital skills of the workforce and the ability of the organization's leaders to set an agenda and direction for digital, and their commitment to and understanding of digital transformation. And finally, the actual, not the espoused, the actual culture of the organization in such areas as customer service, risk-taking, and innovation. Finally, under capability execution, we look at three areas. We look at automation, where we have all the basic computerization, digitization activities, such as removing paper forms, integrating data, workflow. Building on that, we have under experience, we've put all the things that make dealing with our organization easier and more convenient from the end user or consumer's point of view. So the ability for users to interact with us through the channel that's convenient for them when they want to. That'd be multi-channel. Moving on to omni-channel, where I can seamlessly switch between channels. And our ability to personalize and anticipate that interaction. So, for example, if I have to fill a form in to request something, to what extent can that request be managed through a channel other than the web or app? And to what extent can my organization anticipate that request or even negate the need for it? Relevant technologies to look out for here include cloud, which allows us to automatically scale without explicit requests from users. An API-first approach that allows us to more easily open up multi- and omni-channel interaction and create new value from existing services. Conversational interfaces that support self-service and meet customer expectations. Certainly nowadays, anyone under 18 doesn't really want to talk to anybody in real time. I've heard that's what parents are for. They just want to text and chat to bots. Fair enough. And finally, predictive analytics for personalization. Finally, under true transformation, we include using digital to create new disruptive business models and create new value. Platform businesses are the archetypal disruptive business model, although let's be clear that for most businesses that's not going to happen. That is for the 0.0001% of businesses that are able to make that leap. What's more realistic is to create new services and reach new markets using digital technologies. A couple of examples of that might be you're a distribution company or you have distribution and logistics as part of your business, and you open up your distribution system data via an API to your partners, potential other customers. Another example would be digitizing physical objects and using that data to enhance or create new services. We should note here that what's transformative for you might not be transformative for another organization. And as I've mentioned before, what's transformative today is likely to become table stakes tomorrow. Okay, so we've looked at what we're going to assess, which is capabilities, and what we're going to assess them against, which is the dimensions. Now we're going to look at some of the assessment techniques. There's a range of techniques available to you, from meetings to questionnaires to more ethnographic and immersive approaches such as observation and participation. It's not within the scope of this webinar to go into these in detail, but each technique does require skill and it does require experience. And the greater the skill and experience you have, the better will be the results that the assessment gets. So what you'll use to depend on what's being assessed, the time available for you and for the people that you're talking to, your skill and the user's preferences. So for example, if you're assessing leadership, you may want to inspect some documents, meet with the leadership team, and include some questions in a general questionnaire to staff. Obviously, the objective here is to get the best quality data you can, but also to back that up with specific examples. So we are after quantitative data, but let's not underestimate or forget about qualitative data as well. Okay. So now we come on to how to actually score the assessment. Yet again, what you use depends on the context of your assessment, the time, the people available, the level of granularity, and so on. So I'm going to illustrate a couple of scoring systems that we use. And these are examples, just examples. The first is the use of rubrics. In this example, we're assessing the capability execution dimensions against a rubric, which is generally a pretty good way of doing it. In the context of a digital maturity assessment, a rubric is a descriptive guide to assessing the maturity of the organization. It's a set of indicators that we're not going to score against individually, we're going to take as a basket. Rubrics have got quite a lot of benefits associated with them. So I'm just seeing a message pop up. Okay, so asking for questions. They're narrative based, and so they allow some flexibility in their application. They're good for developing a high-level consensus on what constitutes digital maturity. They can be used to scope a more granular scoring system, and I'll show you that in the next slide. They're relatively quick to develop, and importantly, they're a great starting point for helping to identify the target maturity model. When you've got lots of data points, that's hard to see the big picture and identify the target maturity level you want to get to. A rubric is quite intuitive where you want to be there. So the target maturity level is usually confirmed towards the end of the assessment, as it's usually only at that point that the threats and opportunities are fully unearthed and fully understood. So rubrics are one scoring method we use. I'm trying to page down to the next one. Here we go. So the next one is to use survey style statements along with a Likert scale. So a Likert scale is where you have a 5 or 7 point scale, usually going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So this scoring technique is, of course, really useful for actual surveys and questionnaires, but it can also be used with face-to-face and ethnographic assessment techniques. So you don't have to send this to somebody. You can just be sat there in your notepad, and you can ask the questions or talk around the questions and score as a result of that. In this type of scoring, the statement describes the highest level of digital maturity applicable for the dimension under inspection, and the responses from strongly disagree to strongly agree are tagged with a score that enables us to assess the current digital maturity level against the ideal. Hopefully you can see that there. In the spreadsheet on the slide, we've got multiple statements for a particular dimension, people. So we've broken people down into leadership, digital literacy, accessibility and culture, and then within that we've broken them down into another level to them which we've attached one or more questions. We can apply weighted averages to each question to get a relative weighted score for each question, and roll that up at each level of dimension. That's hopefully fairly basic stuff to do on a spreadsheet. So the final thing is to work with the assessment results. I'll just leave this slide up to have a look at. So once you've done all that scoring, you've got it in a lot of spreadsheets, and you pull it together in an overall scoring spreadsheet. So you can see here we have levels of capability on the left-hand side. We've got just 2 showing out of many in this list. This capability model is the U-Sizer HE capability model. So we tend to try and work with a standard model, either if the organisation doesn't have its own, because this can potentially be used across organisations if we get enough organisations using the model. Plus, it's likely to be meaningful to the customer. So the U-Sizer HE capability model defines 3 levels of capabilities. So you can see here we have the 2 that are showing a strategy and governance and teaching and learning. Within that, they break down into strategy management, business capability management, and corporate governance, etc. And within that, level 2 capabilities. And it's level 2 capabilities in this particular instance that we want to score against. We could just choose to score against level 1 or even level 0 capabilities. Almost certainly level 0 would be too high. Level 1 might be okay for a quick and dirty high level assessment. Level 2 is probably where you're going to get the most value, but obviously you've got to invest a lot more in the time to get that value out of it. It's also got here a column for services, which I haven't populated in this particular version. You can break down those capabilities. You can identify the services that deliver the capabilities, but in this particular instance, I'm not doing that, but it's there in the overall framework if we wanted to. We also have a treatment column, which has the values of run, grow, or transform. That's a Gartner framework for assessing the investment that IT puts into various capabilities. And that's really there just as an aid memoir. It doesn't actually drive the scoring in any way. Moving over to the right, For each capability, the model provides a unique code and a description. And the 3 dimensions of change focus, people, and execution are all rolled up scores from other spreadsheets. They then average into the current score for the capability and for the organization overall. And by comparing the current of the target, we can set a RAG status for that particular capability. Now, again, the rules you set for that are completely up to you. I think here, if the difference is 0 or the current is ahead of the target, it's green. If it's the difference is up to 1, it's -1, it's in amber, and if it's more than 1, it goes to red. So that's just a way of saying we've done this at the assessment. These are the areas where the target maturity and the current digital maturity are well out of sync. So they're areas you might want to look at first. Well, that's just one way of using these results. Okay. So we can see there that the assessments roll up from the lower level capabilities to the higher level capabilities. As well as getting a view of the organization's digital maturity by capability, we can also analyze maturity by the 3 digital dimensions and the detail under them, depending on the level that the scoring is undertaken at. So I can see that at a level of, for the capability of business capability management, I have a score of 3 for my change focus, 2 for my people, and 1.7 for my execution. Whereas that's different for teaching and learning, where I've got 3 for each of those, where I score 3 for each of those. So that shows me that that made me want to explore why my people score is a lot lower in one capability area than another. And that's really where the value of this assessment model lies. Although it does spit out a result that indicates a current level of maturity at a particular capability or organizational level, in some ways that's the least important thing you'll get from a good assessment initiative. And what's likely to be of even more value is all the things you've discovered and your colleagues have discovered that you didn't know, people that had never met in the organization before, people that had seen each other across a desk but they didn't have a clue what they did. Now they're talking, now they know what they are, now they know what their focus is, what they're interested in. And hopefully undertaking the assessment has also created a sense of direction and a grasp of the opportunity available. So I guess the message there is, yes, the assessment is an end in itself and the score is an end in itself, but there's a lot more value. That's probably 30 to 40% of the total value you'll get out of the assessment. You know, the process of going through the assessment itself is you'll find a lot more value created. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I don't know if Chris can take over. He was having problems getting on earlier, whether it's still just me. Chris, step in if you can do so. If you can't, we have got time for some questions. Oh, you can see a message coming up. So let's see what we've got. No, it's just me. Okay. Okay. So, Chris, do you want to let me know if we've had any questions? Okay, so what's the question? So we have a question: how does what my competitors are doing fit into my own assessment? Is it important to be reactive to what they're doing digitally? Well, that's a great question. Yeah, a challenging one. So clearly, if your competitors are ahead of you in terms of digital maturity, then we might think that all else being equal, they have a competitive advantage. However, that would only be true if by using the technology, they are creating additional value. It would be wrong and possibly oversimplifying to assume that that's going to be the case. There are certainly many tales of woe of companies who've adopted a particular technology and it's dragged them down or even out of existence. So let's not assume just because a competitor is using a particular technology that we have to use it too, and it's a good idea. It depends to a certain extent how much you respect that competitor. So it's important to be aware of what the competition is doing, but being a fast follower is a good strategy in terms of mitigating risk while still being able to realize a lot of benefits. So be aware of what your competitors are doing, and that should at very least inform your target maturity level. But as I say, don't take it at face value. Okay. Okay, so we have another question here. New technologies like RPA, robotic process automation, or blockchain come up every now and then. How do I assess if those technologies are right for my organization specifically? Okay, another good question. Okay, I'll start by giving you the wrong way to assess this. That would be to buy in the tech and the expertise without having at least a high level prima facie business case for using it. So if we're going to assess something, we need to find relevant cases in our sector, or even better, in other sectors that we can leverage. That would be more innovative. That will inform you about what the potential value, and by value I mean benefit over cost, what the potential value might be. And wherever that use case sits in your organization, you need to find an innovation champion who's really keen to explore the benefits of the technology, so much like finding the right product or service owner for the assessment itself. Without that person, you're pushing a rock up a hill all the way, and it will just be a technology fest for its own sake. So your initial assessment should probably be some kind of feasibility study, which could be a desk study followed by a short, if successful, followed by a short proof of concept. And finally, just be very, when you are doing an assessment, just be very clear about what constitutes success for that feasibility study, for that proof of concept, and evaluate hard against those success criteria. So don't just assess and then say, so what do we do next? You determine what you're going to do next before you do the assessment, because you set some really stringent success criteria and agree what's going to happen if you meet them. Okay, got another question here. How do you define maturity levels for small and medium scale manufacturing enterprises? Again, I would start with the rubrics. What's important to manufacturing? There's a lot of transformation going on around manufacturing now, from outsourcing to Industry 4.0 to Internet of Things, 3D printing. So there's a lot of concepts, a lot of technologies coming into play, and my starting point would be to shape those into some sort of rubric. As you saw before, we had the capability execution rubrics. Shape those up, discuss those internally with the leadership team or whoever you're running this assessment is, and get some sort of general consensus on what's important. If you don't yourself work in manufacturing, then obviously you need to go and do that research. Do that research first. Okay, I think at this point we're going to wrap up. Thanks for your questions. Thank you for attending, and a recording will be sent out to them for your review later. We'll be happy to discuss any aspect of this with you. I think we do offer a free half-day presentation on digital maturity assessment for your organisation, if that's something that would be of interest. So finally, apologies for the hitches we had at the start of the seminar, webinar. I hope that's been useful to you. Once again, thank you very much. Goodbye.